All right, welcome back, folks, to another episode of the Drinking and Talking Fantasy Football Podcast. Big day for us here at Drinking Fantasy. We're
Biggest
live.
day.
Look at us.
This is us.
Look at us getting all the technology going here.
This is like those later episodes of the Drew Carey show where they'd randomly do like a live episode, out of the blue, or like 30 Rock where they would just throw down a live episode and people weren't expecting it. I feel like that's what we've got going on here.
Yeah, a little bit. But it's going to be much better because, let's face it, we're awesome.
Better. I already thought I was shooting above our standard for comparing us to 30 Rock, but all right, man, we can try.
That's right. So, for those of you who have not joined us in the past, I am Dustin Lunt, your host. You can find me on Twitter at FFDustyDog. And my co-host, the other handsome gentleman in the other screen here, Jake Trowbridge. How are you doing, Jake?
Good. I am hanging in there. I'm still slowly recovering from a little bit of a low-grade ailment here that I had this week. I don't know why, man. I just got pummeled with shit here these last couple of weeks. So I'm not having a typical beer of choice because it just didn't sound good to me. So I'm doing something a little bit more medicinal, I feel like.
You're staying on brand, though. You're still drinking. That's all that matters.
Yeah, that was the important thing. I knew, especially in this live episode, I couldn't not be having an adult beverage in my hand.
Yeah, not in the first one, at least.
Yeah. Speaking of which, what are you drinking?
I am drinking from More Brewing Company. We'll get it in front of the camera here.
Oh, yeah.
This is Lil Dusty. It is the Citra Dry Hopped Pale Ale coming in at 5.6%. Can you be real with me? Do you buy beers because they have your name in the title? Well, this one, yes. I mean, why wouldn't you? If you saw Jake beer, like, you wouldn't go out and buy it.
Yeah, you know what pisses me off is there really is no Jake beer that I've ever seen out in the world. I was hoping at least like Jake Busey by this point would have come out with his own beer. That's Gary Busey's son, by the way. Just want to let you know that. So if he could just do me a solid and produce one, then I would drink probably nothing else. So you're right.
Well, there is that. So you said you weren't drinking beer. What are you drinking?
I'm drinking a nice little pink drink here. It really does look like medicine. I feel like it's like Pepto-Bismol colored. It's a Deep Eddy grapefruit flavored vodka, a little soda, a little squeeze of lime in that bad boy.
Nice. It sounds delicious. Sounds very refreshing. Let's put it that way.
Summer beverage. We're in the summertime. I would play part of that Will Smith song right now, but I don't think we have the rights cleared to it. So
no, and I don't have the money available to pay for said lawsuit against us.
And Will Smith would be coming in hard right now, given all of the stuff that's happening to him and Jada over these last weeks. We can't risk it. But that's all right. Anyways, did we even talk about what this episode is about?
No, we didn't. You were so excited to talk about your drink that we just skimmed right over it.
I know.
So this week we are talking redraft strategies. We're in the middle of July here. Training camp is, quote unquote, scheduled to start here in the next couple weeks. We know there's probably not going to be preseason games at this point, but some people do start drafting as soon as training camp starts for the upcoming season. So we figured, why not get an episode out there talking about our redraft strategies and things to think about during your draft so that you are better prepared to win your league, because that's what we're all here for.
Well, I mean, yes, hypothetically, I want to win my league, but mostly I just don't want to look like an asshole at the draft. That's really my biggest motivator for fantasy football.
Yeah, there is that as well.
Which I don't know if I accomplished during Scott Fish Bowl, but that's we don't have to talk about that.
No, we don't.
You know what we do have to talk about, though?
What's that?
Our drunk trade.
That's right. What do we got, Jake?
This one is just a delight. It comes in from at AA_Ron14. AA Ron. This is a fresh one too. So, and you know what? He didn't even technically submit this, but I found it out in the world. And I said that we had to bring it onto the show because it was just that good. So all the tweet said was, what did I do after drinking all day? I woke up to me trading Sanders. That's Miles Sanders.
I was going to say, not Emmanuel.
Not Emmanuel. That is Miles Sanders for Kenyon Drake and Jordan Howard. So this one felt very bad for the person who posted it on Twitter. But the reason that I want to talk about this one, I'm not sure if it's that lopsided of a trade, if I'm being honest.
I think for this year, it's probably not that lopsided, but I think long term, he definitely lost out on that. I love both Kenyon Drake and Miles Sanders for this year. And for that fact, I kind of low key like Jordan Howard as well. At least to get that first and second down rushing on his team. Flex play. Let's be honest. I'm not saying that he is going to be an all-star, but for this year, yeah, I don't think that's that bad. But for next year or moving on in Dynasty, I would much rather have Miles Sanders. Kenyon Drake is what, 27 years old, I believe.
Kenyon Drake, okay, whatever his real age is, which I'll look it up. He's 26 right now.
26, I'm sorry.
So he'll be 26 throughout the season. He's a January birthday. He's a Sagittarius. Kenyon Drake, I think it's a Sagittarius. I don't know. Kenyon Drake is 26 now, but his legs are only like 22 because he's barely gotten any run while he was in Miami. It's like a Lamar Miller situation, but I guess that's not the best comp because we all know what happened to Lamar Miller.
Exactly.
But so you're worried about Kenyon Drake for like the next couple of years, or you just really like Miles Sanders for many years?
I just really like Miles Sanders for the long term. He's got a few years of age on him, so that's already the first thing that I love. Mm-hmm. I really like their offense there in Philly. You know he's going to be used. Although I suppose you could argue the same thing for Kenyon Drake. We saw what happened last year. It's not that I dislike Kenyon Drake at all. I would just prefer Miles Sanders in this scenario.
That's fair. Well, clearly the person who posted this on Twitter does as well, because those aren't the words of somebody pleased with their drunk trade.
No.
I'm going to say it. But if I'm being honest here, I rate this drunk trade out of a bushel of beers. I rate this like 3 beers deep. Like you're just feeling good enough and you want some activity. I'm saying I don't think it's that bad.
Yeah, it's definitely not the worst we've seen. This is what, maybe a handful of natty lights into the evening?
Yeah, if you're going to be gross and drink natty lights, then yes, fine. I think this is a classier trade than that, personally.
Oh. So what would you rate it then?
Well, obviously, I would rate it a few of your little Dusties or whatever you're drinking currently.
Oh, perfect. That I could get on board with.
See how I brought that back into the fold? You're welcome.
Thank you. All right. Should we get into the meat of the episode here?
Yeah, let's meet it up.
All right. So, redraft strategy. Mm-hmm. Why don't you start us off here, Jake? What's one thing you think we should consider in your draft?
Yeah, there's so many ways that this can go when you're just talking about redraft strategy, because it's wide open. The world is truly your oyster when you're on the clock for redraft. And we've talked about strategies in the past. Certainly you can find previous episodes from last offseason where we're talking about redraft and dynasty strategies for your draft, but it also changes just a little bit every year. I feel like, at least for me, it does. Some people might be stuck in their 2009 thought processes for drafting. It's possible. But if we're going to talk about one thing to really kick this off, I think it has to be flexible. You know, there's a lot of draft preparation that you can do. You can find the mock drafts out there. I love a good mock draft, in fact. But if Scott Fishbowl taught me anything, it's that you should not put too much credence into them, because your league mates are not necessarily going to be following ADP so much that you can predict exactly where your round is going to take you. So you can have a lot of good intentions going into a draft, right? But by round 3, you might have to start throwing half of that shit out because somebody took, Rob Gronkowski in the second round. All of a sudden, that opens up some new possibilities for you because that person's a fucking idiot. So you have to be flexible on your redraft strategy.
Absolutely, especially in your home league. It's a little bit different if you're on Twitter and you're involved in the fantasy community on Twitter, where you might get in a redraft with some quote unquote more expert type personalities out there. But yeah, your home leagues, it's all bets are off. As we have found out in our home league here, it's just we can do all the prep in the world, but come draft day, it's just a fucking crapshoot.
It's absurd. When 8 quarterbacks fly off the board in the first 2 rounds, all of a sudden, yeah, those expert mocks that you were participating in, or those lovely, there are a lot of mock apps out there now, which are all wonderful, by the way. I love, like, Fantasy Pros has a great one too. That's just an automated, you don't need to wait on a bunch of real life people to do it. It just spits out through ADP on an automated basis. But again, that does not take into account some of your idiot league mates from your own league. So, God, I really hope none of them are listening to this at the moment, by the way.
Well, they had to find out eventually. We're not naming names, let's be clear. We're just saying some of them.
That's very true. It could be any one of them, but they know who they are.
That's right. So kind of going hand in hand with that, as kind of, as you're saying, staying fluid, staying water when you're drafting, make sure you're capitalizing on that value if value is coming to you. So like you said, if quarterbacks, say 8 quarterbacks in your scenario go in the first round, well, there's going to be a crap ton of running backs and wide receivers that are going to fall because of that. So take advantage of that in all of the knowledge we're providing you. Take advantage. Draft those guys, let the value come to you, and kind of let the draft unfold to your feet there, and draft accordingly.
Yeah. Can I ask you a question, though? So when we're talking about letting value fall, which I think is a great point, because at a certain point, you just have to deal with the draft board as it comes to you. But is there a point in the draft for you, because this has happened to me, where there's a guy that I do not want on my team? I plainly just don't want this guy. But he's fallen so far down the draft board that I feel like an idiot for passing up the perceived value of that player in that round. You got a guy whose ADP is the 3rd round. Somehow he makes it down to you in the 6th. I still don't like this player. I don't really believe in this player. But there's almost a point where, like, I feel tricked into taking them because of that perceived value. So do you, in your mindset, when that happens, are you strong enough to move on? Or do you sometimes feel like you have to take them?
I think it depends on the player.
Ooh, what a cop-out.
I know. I just, let's be honest, my convictions aren't that strong when it comes to certain players and not having them on my team for whatever reason, because this is fantasy football and I'm ultimately out to win. I don't really have anything personally invested in these said players.
I'm not talking from a personal standpoint either, like, off the field shenanigans or whatever, but just like, you don't really think that they're that great, and typically you would avoid them, but it's like, at what point do you have to put your own ADP or your own tiers aside almost in favor of value?
Well, at some point I would. I guess it just depends on, again, who that player is and how far they're falling in the draft, based on the tiers that I come up with. So I don't know if you've seen out on Twitter, and for the folks out there, I've been posting my top redraft preseason or middle of the off season ranking for the upcoming season here. And I come up with my own tiers based on those rankings. and I go off of that. So if there's a guy that's, say, in my tier 2 that was, around 3, and he's the only one left, and also there's a bunch of guys in like tier 4 or tier 5, well, yeah, I'd probably draft him just because I feel like he would have a good season. So I would draft him because I'm getting much better value. Because I would have him ranked how I figure his season's going to end up. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. Speaking of, so where you value these guys, when you're going through your tier, which I think is a great point that we should talk about, because you said tiers. Notice you didn't say like hardcore ranks. We do, and I did my first real true rankings here in this off season. But there's a major difference between rankings and tier groups and what you use to follow along with at your draft. I mean, speaking back to our home league, it's like you can print off that top 300 list from ESPN, and you can follow that along for your draft, and you can do it based off of rankings. But I feel like that's a little more fickle, and tiers seem to be a better way to go. Now, you are a lot better about creating tiers for your players. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and I can't really say I'm super technical or have a very definite plan of how I attack my tiers. Basically, I go through and I have my rankings of what I think the players are going to be projected finishing the season at. Most players, I just assume health in 16 games, unless I know, for instance, like Deebo Samuel. I don't know that he would be back to start the season necessarily, maybe miss a game or two. So I adjusted that accordingly in his stats. But then I just take a look at how the players end up being ranked in their season totals for points. And then I just put them into tiers based on those point totals within a specific range. And each tier is a little bit different on what that range is. Some tiers could have one guy or two guys. Some, as you get later down, will have 20 guys in it. Just kind of depends on the position and where we are in the draft of how I think they're going to finish.
Do you put them in tiers based on position, or do you just put them based on general scoring and let yourself sort it out on the draft?
I do it by position. So I have tiers set up for each position. Again, so I can see, okay, there's been a run on quarterbacks. I'm now in tier 5, but there's a tier 2 wide receiver still available. I would probably go for the tier 2 wide receiver because that will have better value than drafting a quarterback at this position.
I love that. And I think that leads into another great point that we should be making here. So when we had JJ Zacharyson on the podcast a few episodes ago, drink, by the way, name drop. When we had him on, one of the biggest things that he said was like, for wide receivers in redraft, it's a lot easier to know who's kind of going to be that top tier a lot of the times. Like it's hard to find those guys who are going to suddenly become a top 12 wide receiver at the back end of your draft. And so obviously when you're deciding on tiers too, and you're looking between positions, you're going to have to give some consideration to that. You're going to have to figure out like, all right, I've got a few options at quarterback. And that's where it can get tricky though, is if you've only got 3 or 4 guys that you're comfortable with all of a sudden at quarterback left on the board. And even though they're at a much lower tier than what those wide receivers are that are on the board, it's like, what do you do in that situation? I mean, do you fall into the trap of, I got to chase that QB because there might not be any left to me, or do you just go for the value, the best available player, if you will, for the wide receiver then?
It depends if it's one of my late round QBs that I really think is going to have a really good season. And again, it kind of depends on the flow of your draft. So if you're at the point being a late round QB, as we like to do in our drafts, if teams are starting to draft a second quarterback already, and you haven't drafted your first one yet, that would be time where you probably have to forego your tiers just so you can get your solid starter. You can always play off the waiver wire later in the season to pick up another quarterback or something, but you really do need a solid starter to start the season. and someone you think is going to play all 16 games. So that's where I would forego the tiers. It's kind of based on how your draft is going, and each individual person needs to, monitor their draft and make that decision.
Interesting. And one thing that's really a good consideration of that is like, don't get too scared about runs when a positional run happens, but you have to be a little bit cautious about it. I don't think you should over invest just because people are suddenly taking this position. And it's easy to get really trigger happy in those situations. It's like, let's say, hypothetically, you're in a spot where you're at the 11th pick. So you're at the turn. You have a lot of picks coming and going before you get back on the clock. You've got, if my math is correct here, you've got about 20 picks that are happening between you and your next round. So if you start to see, say hypothetically, 6 quarterbacks fly off the board at that point, that's a good amount. But look at your rankings and see how many guys here would I actually really truly be happy with if I pass on them for this round and roll the dice again, versus what kind of value could I get at the running back position here. And like, don't get scared off so much that you pass up those great values, I guess, is the point, right?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And it can be scary. And sometimes you're going to lose out on that end of the deal, by taking that chance. But it's fantasy football. Have some fun with it. Take the chances every once in a while, because that one chance you take and you draft that player, say, instead of a quarterback, that could be the player that breaks out and has an amazing season and wins you the championship.
Right. It's like, hey, do you want to feel good that you ended up with Derek Carr on your team because he's like the last guy basically available? And at that point, you might as well just punt the whole fucking draft if you really have to deal with Derek Carr. Just whatever, deal with it. Or am I going to be that guy who, snags Deontay Johnson when he inevitably finishes as a top 15 receiver this year?
Right. Or it could have been last year drafting Mark Andrews super late instead of maybe grabbing your first quarterback in that, round 9 to 11 range. He could have been a league winner for you. So it's just something to consider and keep in mind when you're drafting.
Yeah. Or if you're a baller like I am and you just pick up Lamar Jackson after you've fulfilled all of your other positional needs, and then you still don't win your league somehow.
Yeah. So speaking of being on runs, and we had a comment here from one of our YouTube viewers here.
Hi, Jordan.
Let's start the run. So that's great if you can start runs. That is awesome. But if you find yourself on the bad side of a run, don't tilt. Try to take some emotion out of this. Look at it from kind of a more, not to say clinical aspect, but just don't tilt. Just stay relaxed. Have a sip of beer or your cocktail of choice, or water if you don't drink. That's fine. But just don't tilt. Just because if you tilt, you start making bad decisions, and it can just snowball the rest of your draft and really put you in a bad spot. So just try to keep a level head when your guys get sniped or you find yourself at the end of a run, and things will work out in the end.
First of all, you know how hard it is not to tilt after you've been drinking in preparation for your draft. Especially in those middle rounds, it's almost impossible not to do at least a little bit of tilting once your few drinks in, at least for me. But one thing I want to call out is actually a shout out to the FF Hitman, to Mike Wright. There's one thing that he said that has really stuck with me. He said he just randomly threw it out on Twitter like it's no big fucking deal. But he said it was in regards to trades, but it definitely applies here. He said one bad trade does not ruin your team. You make a bad trade, you deal with it, you put that shit in the past. He didn't say shit, but I know he wanted to. And then you make another better trade after that. Right? Like, you don't compound the issue by just dwelling on that terrible trade that you made. And then because of that, now you force yourself into making another trade that you don't want to make a trade. that you didn't want to make, and then you have to make another trade that you didn't want to make to try and reverse the effects of that trade. It's like, just leave that go, and that's the same deal with drafting. Whatever you did in round 6 doesn't necessarily have to affect your entire team. You don't need to let it do that.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Chill.
It's okay in the moment. Have a little mini tilt for about 30 seconds. Just tilt for a minute there. Get it off your chest, and then move on.
I like it.
All right. So what else? What other advice do you have for redraft here?
You know what my biggest one is that we've talked about almost too much on this show, but because of the episode, we have to talk about a little bit more. Avoid rookie wide receivers unless, caveat, unless you are very confident in your personal assessments of those players, or you have somebody that you truly believe in that you can reference, who is a good scout. You know, one of the two. Like if you have some level of confidence in them and you know that they're your guy or that they'll produce this year, go for them, man. Because it's fantasy football, get your guys. But in general, I'm all about avoiding rookie wide receivers, especially at the draft, because maybe they will be great for you in week 9. And they very well could be, because they could come on. I mean, guys who had A.J. Brown, I think he's a great example from last year. We talked about him plenty during the season last year. Mm-hmm. He had a blow-up game. I think it was maybe week 4. He had a blow-up game. In fact, I came back the next episode and called for him to have a back-to-back blow-up game. Did not happen. He did not become super-duper relevant again until later in the season. And then, yes, at that point, he was actually great for your team. But those first weeks, it's just a roster clog at that situation. Hopefully you held on to the guy and dealt with it. But also, if you held on to the guy, you had that dicey proposition of starting him, not starting him. It made your decisions tougher for your lineup. I try and avoid that as much as possible. And I'll scoop him up off the waiver wire, hopefully, before somebody else does. But otherwise, I'm passing.
Mm-hmm. Same here. We are definitely avoid rookie wide receivers on this podcast.
We should change the name of the podcast to avoid rookie wide receivers. That's how strongly we feel about this.
Yes. Yeah. Later in the season, like you said, wait until later in the season, use your waiver priority to get those guys once they start getting more involved with their offense. Because let's be honest, wide receiver is a difficult position to pick up on the nuance of, as opposed to running backs. Running backs, they just go hand the ball, you hit the hole, you make your own hole, juke some guys and go. Like, it's not quite as involved as a wide receiver, where you have to have the timing down with the quarterback. You know, you have to be running the right route. There's different coverages. It's just a different beast that it takes a little bit more for wide receivers, I feel, to get comfortable in the offense. So that's why you see the later season breakouts like the A.J. Browns of the world.
Yeah, I don't want to like oversimplify that. You can just toss in a rookie running back and feel good about it no matter what. There are some things that you have to look into. You have to look at what their competition truly is in the backfield. Are they okay as a blocker? You know, can they do pass protection okay enough to stay on the field? Like, sure, you have to consider a couple of things, but it's not nearly as much as for rookie wide receivers.
No.
Yeah.
So, but I mean, the reason I said that is because we see wide receivers, running backs all the time. One running back goes down, another one comes in, and really there's not normally a ton of drop off in production. So it's a more replaceable position.
Unless you're talking about like Patrick Laird, I would say there is a pretty steep drop off in production. Actually, that's not true, because who was ahead of him on the depth chart? Wasn't that your man?
Myles Gaskin?
Well, no, not Myles Gaskin. Caleb Valage, yeah.
He's so not really, my man.
I know, but I'm going to try and stick you with that before the year is done here. Speaking about young players, let's go to the opposite side of the spectrum then. The overlooked gem for redraft leagues, especially if you are in a dynasty mindset. If you play mostly dynasty, which we've both kind of transitioned into now, it can be sometimes tough to dig yourself out of that.
It really is.
right? And so sometimes I think older players get too overlooked because people are thinking it from a dynasty perspective. And so you don't want to pass up just because they're old. You don't want to totally pass them over. Are there
Right.
guys? Yeah, are there guys that you feel very comfortable in drafting this year that might be overlooked because they're just old?
Couple guys off the top of my head, and one I drafted in Scott Fishbowl was Larry Fitzgerald. I got him, I think, in the 17th round of my draft. I saw him going in like the 20th round of drafts. It's like the dude is still going to contribute. I mean, maybe he doesn't have the ceiling he used to, but he's going to have a solid floor. Like he's going to break some records this year. So you got to imagine that he's going to have a good floor. Another one, and I don't know how much of a stretch this really is. It's Julian Edelman. I personally am kind of out on him a little bit, but he's 34 years old, but he does nothing but produce. But people might think this year, with Brady being gone, Cam Newton's coming in, they're changing, we'll change the offense a little bit. He hasn't been the bastion of health throughout his career. So he's someone that if he does drop in drafts, I will probably try to snag him up a little later, just because chances are pretty good he's going to have another solid season. Will it be wide receiver 1 or that mid-range wide receiver 2 like we're used to seeing out of him? That might be a bit of a stretch, but you never know, though, either. Like, it could happen because he's continued to do it for years.
It could happen. I was actually really excited about it happening again with Jarrett Stidham there. I was so ready to scoop up Edelman when he inevitably fell in redraft formats, and even make some really low offers in Dynasty for him, just pretending and all that. But then when Cam, and now I am scared because I don't know if Cam is going to utilize him the same way. I don't feel like he's going to jump off in the same way that Jarrett Stidham might have jumped off. That could just be a lack of proper analysis on my part. And I could totally be wrong on this, but yeah, now I'm a little more nervous. But if this makes him drop even further down the board, then there's going to come a point where, as much as I may not love him, I'm probably going to have to take him because of where he falls.
Yeah. Do you have any guys that you're targeting as more veteran overlooked players?
I actually have a couple of running backs that I'm very interested in for this year that are above that cutoff for a lot of people. And first and foremost, it's Mark Ingram, who, God, he's done nothing but be an RB1. He was an RB1 4 out of the last 5 seasons, I believe.
Yes.
And like,
I think the only reason he didn't have 1,000 yards the one season is because he was suspended for the 4 games to start the year. Otherwise, I think he would have been. So yeah, he's been nothing but consistency and solid and healthy throughout his career, and he's perpetually overlooked. I 100% agree.
Yeah, and the big issue now is he's 30, and so there you go, 30-year-old running back. I'm out. However, this is why it's important to look a little closer, is that while it's true, not many 30-year-old running backs have given you super high fantasy production. It's worth noting that the dude barely had any rushing attempts for the first few years of his career. So again, it's the age, yes, but it's also the amount of attempts that affect that age. And he had super low attempts, super low volumes for those first 3 years. So really, I look at him like a 28-year-old running back.
Yeah, I think he is a sneaky pick for this season. I think everybody's writing him off, 1, because of the age, and 2, because of J.K. Dobbins being drafted by the Ravens. I think for this season, he's still going to have a very, very solid season. Now, it may not be what we saw last year quite to that degree, but if he falls in drafts a little bit, I would have no problem scooping him up. He's gonna again have a very solid floor, I feel like, for this season.
Yeah, he's going as the RB26 right now, and he's the lowest guy in ADP that I see that I truly believe could and will finish as an RB1 or near RB1 status. So he just seems like an obvious value to me. Another guy who I'm interested in that a lot of people are not as interested in is Le'Veon Bell. And I understand the Adam Gase concerns and the whole offense concerns. But my thought is last year's as bad as it gets. Last year's as bad as it gets for that team. There is nowhere to go but up. And he still finished as a serviceable running back last year. He was RB 15? Question mark?
There. Yeah, I mean, we did discuss this in greater detail last week on our AFC East divisional preview. So go back and listen to that episode if you want to hear all the details. But I 100% agree again with you. I would totally take him as my RB2 on my team this season, without a doubt. If he fell to me as my RB2, I would be ecstatic.
And there's a very good chance that he will.
Yeah. I mean, the Jets really tried to bolster their offensive line this year. So assuming everyone comes into the season healthy and they're able to get some practice time where they can gel a bit, there's no reason why he can't produce better than he did last year.
I agree. We are in such agreement. Is it just because we're so happy to be broadcasting live? Is that why we're so agreeable here tonight?
I think so. Or just great minds think alike. Are you saying we don't have great minds?
Look, I'm hopeful that that's the case, but I just don't know. That's more of an indictment against me than it is you, Dustin. Don't worry.
Okay, good.
But is there anything this year in particular that you're looking to implement for your strategies more so than in previous years? Have you looked at it that way where you're considering some different types of moves than you would previously?
More so this year than previous years. I'm going to stay away from rookies, especially early in the draft. Because, like Clyde Edwards-Helaire, Jonathan Taylor, maybe even like the CeeDee Lambs of the world, or Jalen Reagors, like they might go somewhat early in the draft just because of the hype and the name and opportunity on their teams. But with the limited training camp and actual practice times, I feel like teams are going to have, I want to stay away from them more so than previous seasons and really stick more with the veteran guys, just because they've already been in the offense and have rapport with the quarterback or the other players on the squad. Same goes for players that were traded or moved teams in the offseason. So like DeAndre Hopkins. Don't get me wrong, still very high on him. He'll probably be a top 10 wide receiver without a doubt. But unless he falls a little bit, I have slight concerns. Let's put it that way. We've seen him produce with just god awful quarterbacks in the past, but this is going to be a totally new offensive scheme for him. So I have some concerns. So those two things are kind of things I'm looking at for this upcoming year to kind of avoid or maybe step off the gas a little bit.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. And more so than ever, rookie tight ends, boy, woof. Like, do I not want anything to do with you? Last year, it was a little bit different because you've got TJ Hawkinson coming in. You've got Noah Fant coming in. You've got these guys just high-credentialed dudes. Mm-hmm. So people were making exceptions. They were still stretching. I feel like they still went earlier than they should have last year, even given those high credentials and even given the fact that they had a full offseason to acclimate and all that. Now the short offseason is 100% in there. And there's nobody who is that, to me, I haven't seen anybody flaunted that way of a Hawkinson or Fant. Adam Trout is the name that keeps getting thrown around.
Cole Kmet?
Yeah. Nah.
Or is he buried under the other 5,000 tight ends on the Bears squad?
Yes. Here's what's going to happen. And we can relish it this year because he's no longer on the Packers. Is that Jimmy Graham will go fodle his way around for about 2.3 yards per catch, but they'll just trot him out there because he's reliable, in air quotes. So I'm not feeling the Kmet love like some people are, though. Him and Adam Troutman have both been getting weird amounts of hype kind of off and on throughout this offseason. I'm just not buying it. I get why people did it for Scott Fishbowl because you're looking at a lot of upside in those
exactly.
for the fences. But if to me, it's a wasted pick if you're picking up somebody like that. And same with Devin Asiasi, Patriots rookie tight end, or the other one, whose name I forget.
Yeah, let's be honest. Bill Belichick knows what he's doing. The reason why Gronk was such a big thing is because it was freaking Gronk, and he was a generational tight end. Belichick knew this and game planned the offense around that. He doesn't have a generational Gronk on his team anymore, so he's not going to game plan that. So stop trying to get Patriots tight ends to be a thing anymore. That's just not a thing.
It's square peg and round hole. Okay.
Exactly. Yes.
The only thing I had a brief moment. I'll be transparent here because I like to show my warts as much as my accolades here. Is when Cam signed to New England, there was a brief part of me that thought, oh wait, he also loves tight ends. Maybe there is something to this. And I was thinking like maybe I target, the quote unquote veteran tight end on that. Until I looked and saw who
Matt Lacoste
was on the veteran squad of that team. And I was like,
there's no one there.
Maybe I shouldn't do that. But yeah, I don't know, man. Like young quarterbacks, even I'm scared for. Joe Burrow, I'm scared for this year, and I know he's going to go higher than I would ever take him.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, and the whole shortened offseason then with offensive lines, because the hope was that Cincinnati's offensive line is going to get better because he had a pick last year that was injured all last year. That was a very high grade guy that's going to come in and he's going to help that situation out. And I think they traded for somebody else that's going to come in and help make them better. But if they don't have time, if that unit doesn't have time to get together, it's going to be tough to expect that. So now I'm nervous about Joe Burrow and a little bit about Joe Burrow's pass catchers as well. I don't know.
Yeah, yes and no. I mean, there'll be some bumps in the road, but chances are they're going to be playing from behind in a lot of games. So they're going to have to throw a lot. So for the wide receivers, at least, I think they'll be fine. AJ Green, Tyler Boyd, they'll be fine this season. Joe Mixon, he'll get his, especially if they kind of continue to what they did towards the end of last season, where we really saw him come on. But yeah, that's an offense I might not be investing too heavily in. Again, if my tiers say so and the value's there, then yes, I will. But it might be. I'll probably take a second think about it here. Extra swig of beer before I make a draft pick.
Yeah, there you go. Some extra thinking juice before you click the button on that one. Well, speaking of AJ Green, here's a good time to transition into this thought. Injury prone. We hate using that phrase. And I'm not going to say the quote unquote thing anymore around injury prone because I've already in my head realized I've said that a lot this episode. I feel like that should be added to the drinking game sheet because I just pumped out about 6 quote unquotes in this first 45 minutes here. But in any case, AJ Green might actually deserve the injury prone tag. And there aren't many players I would ever say that about. But there's the thought of injury discounts. Every year, people really wildly have disproportionate views on what an injury is going to do to a player. And in redraft, again, if your dynasty mindset, it's tough to overlook that sometimes. But you made a note here about like players go after the guys who have that perception that aren't really following that pattern. So like Carson Wentz, Keenan Allen, guys who've had fluke injuries and a good amount of them that have at some point devalued them way too much.
Yeah, like Keenan Allen, like he was injured the first couple seasons, but since then he's been relatively healthy and on the field. But I still think people think of him as injury prone because he had those season-ending back-to-back fluky injuries, like a lacerated kidney. Like,
who the fuck gets a lacerated kidney?
Like it's such a random, odd thing that yes, it happened, but it's not like he's tweaking his hamstring every other week. This is something where it happened once. It's probably a 1 in a million chance that it's not going to happen again, or it will happen again. However that goes, you know what I'm saying.
I know exactly what you're saying.
But yeah, so definitely try to get those injury discounts. And as you see these players falling, take advantage of that. Again, it's all taking advantage of your draft and knowing the tendencies of your home league players, general managers, however you want to say it, in your league. Like we know in our league, there's one person in particular that is a huge Seahawks Raiders fan, and you know that they're going to draft those players eventually, and probably pretty early. So take advantage of that.
Last year, this person took Josh Jacobs in the first round, just to really prove the dedication. Can we also talk about, I know this is off topic, but can we talk about the fact that they're both the Seahawks and Raiders fan, as if that combination just rolls off the tongue and nobody should ever question it? I don't know where that stemmed from, but it's very strange, and I don't like it.
Mm-hmm.
But then know the homers in your league. Like, well, to be fair, in our league, so let's use this as an example, it's a local situation, right? It's our buds that we get together with for this draft. The majority of us are Packers homers.
Mm-hmm.
So you can almost say to yourself, well, I might as well take Aaron Rodgers, Devontae Adams, Aaron Jones, take them all off my draft board because there's no shot in hell that I'm getting them.
Pretty much every single Packer I will not have a shot at drafting this year, unless for some reason, say, I'm at like the end of the first round where I'm at the turn and maybe like Adams falls to me because we do have a bunch of quarterbacks.
Yeah.
That would be like the only way. Other than that, yeah, it's basically for players how comfortable I am drafting them. Say Rodgers, like he's probably not someone I will get because he's still drafted on name value, but he's most likely going to end up outside my top 12 for this season. Not saying he can't finish there, but just our intimate knowledge of the offense and the coaching here, that's just something that I won't be drafting him because he's going to go way too early, and I'm just not going to draft him there.
Speaking of which, can we talk about name value for a second and how much of a mindfuck it is, even for people who are established and study and prepare for these drafts?
Mm-hmm.
I know I give you shit, and I'm self-deprecating as well on this, but we're not complete fucking idiots about fantasy football. But even for us, I think it's sometimes really hard to avoid that name recognition swaying you just a little bit. Another example, and I hate to keep bringing this up because I know people hate hearing about Scott Fishbowl all the fucking time, but on the clock for Scott Fishbowl, I'm in the back of the third round. I'm at 309, and I see DeAndre Hopkins sitting there. In my head, the first thought was, that's DeAndre Hopkins. I have to take him in the third round. My second thought, which came too late, was he's on a new offense with an abbreviated offseason. This could be more trouble. Also, that draft does not emphasize wide receivers. They drop like flies. So that's why he's sitting there. But again, you're on the clock. You're in your head. You're thinking, I see this name. I know this guy. I love this player. So click, boom. Like I'm drafting this guy. And so even it's just that difficulty of being on the clock sometimes and avoiding name recognition. It can be tricky. Do you have any, I don't know, any advice on how not to fall into that trap?
I think it goes back to what we said earlier in this episode. You have your tiers set up and you stick to your tiers. That way, you know right where your guys, where you value them, and you'll know, okay, he's not in the same tier as other players available right now. He's in a tier lower or a couple tiers lower. Don't draft him because of the name, because this is where my tiers are set up. So I think using the tiers and sticking to those is a good way to avoid that. And just another note on doing tiers and projections and everything. If you don't want to go through the effort of coming up with your own projections, because let's be honest, it does take a lot of effort to go through team by team and stat out everyone. If you don't want to do that, find someone you trust out there whether it's us here at Drinking Fantasy or somewhere else in the Twitterverse fantasy football world. Find someone you trust, use their projections to come up with your own tiers. Then that they're taking half the work off the table for you, or 3/4 of the work. Find someone you trust out there and use them to help make yourself better for this upcoming season and seasons beyond.
This is where it's so reasonable too. You see, I used to, when I started fantasy football, I was like, there's no way I'm going to pay $10 for somebody's, charts of where they have players.
Mm-hmm.
I was A, because I was too egotistical for my own good, and B, I was just a cheap ass. But it's like, especially if you're playing a lot of leagues, there are so many great resources like that. And in fact, we can throw up a link on Twitter. I'll do that a little bit later about some resources that I've just seen out there. It's like $5 for this tier formula or whatever the product is. It's so worth it come draft day. Mm-hmm. Like you said, and it's a time saver because I can only get about 2 beers in before my Excel spreadsheets start to look a lot worse than they should be. So,
yeah, not everyone is as into fantasy football and data analysis and everything else like we are, and that's fine. I mean, fantasy football is and should be accessible to everyone, all levels. Use the resources that are out there. We've talked about Fantasy Pros. They're a great free resource out there that you can use. There's a lot of great free resources. If you don't want to pay, you just got to go out and find them. And like I said, find someone you trust or people you trust and use them as guides to help you be more informed, because that's what it's all about. It's being informed, making good decisions as you're going into your draft.
Cough, cough, Ball Blast, cough, cough, Red Shirts, Fantasy Pod. These people who put out this stuff for free on Twitter, that's the thing. You don't even need to spend the $5 because if you find it that you trust and you follow, and that's really, I think, maybe an overlooked part of drafting sometimes is utilizing Twitter. Honestly, not just because notifications are very important on draft day, because if somebody randomly tears an ACL in their backyard playing catch with their kid and you're on the clock, you can avoid drafting them because that kind of shit actually does happen, unfortunately. But also because you can curate your own resources. You follow the people that you want to follow. You can create lists for yourself. Something I didn't know anything about until somebody randomly added me to one a while back. I was like, oh, this is a thing? You can just add specific people to a list. So you can say draft day, prep. Here are the people that I want to follow, whose rankings I trust, whose projections I trust, whose advice I want to follow for this. Use that free resource, and then you can just aggregate that information for yourself. Get some of that other shit out of there that you don't necessarily believe in or trust, and kind of condense it down.
Yeah, and hopefully we are on that list. Let's be honest. We want to be a resource for you. But there are plenty of other great resources out there. So I have at least 2 more things I want to touch on here before we call it a night.
Be gentle.
First off, make sure you study when you're in the draft. You're studying your teammates, other GMs in your league. Study their rosters as you're going through the draft. If it's possible on whatever platform you're using for drafting, if you can see the full draft board, have that up as much as possible, because you can see what positions all the other owners, GMs have drafted already, which can help then inform yourself of what picks might be coming up in the next round or 2 rounds. If someone only has 1 quarterback and a lot of quarterbacks are going off the board, a lot of people are drafting a second quarterback. Well, it's like, maybe they're going to be drafting a second quarterback soon. Maybe I want to possibly jump ahead of them if I feel like the guy I'm shooting for isn't going to make it. So use your draft board to help, again, make informed decisions on the next upcoming couple rounds in your draft.
Would you say you should be looking at your league mates' holes Yeah! That's where you insert the CSI opening thing. Dustin, help me out.
No, it was awful.
God damn it. All right. Fine. I maintain that was a perfectly executed joke. Can I mention one thing that I really want to talk about here before we wrap this up? Is given this season, we've already hinted around it and talked about it a little bit, but the abbreviated shortened off season. Fingers crossed, we're going to have real football this year. If we do, we're still going to have to deal with the fact that practices are not going to be normal. OTAs are not going to be normal.
Mm-hmm.
So along with that, when we had Dr. Edwin Porras on the podcast as well, he mentioned some potential effects of COVID and not exercising correctly and blah, blah, blah. Now, for a lot of that, it was down the road. It wasn't necessarily for this year. It might have been for coming years. But there was some inclination that potentially we could see more injuries this year. Potentially. I'm typically not a handcuff guy. Like running backs, I don't typically running back handcuff. That's not a thing that I want to target in the late rounds. I'm normally foregoing those for high upside wide receivers, tight ends, whatever. This year, I'm really giving some consideration to that. Not even because of the injury aspect, but because of the quarantine aspect, which is if a player tests positive, they're shelved for a couple of weeks. Running back in particular, we just talked about replaceability for running back earlier in the show. It's the easiest position to do that for. So a guy, let's say CMC gets diagnosed with COVID-19. He is on the shelf for 2 weeks. You have to immediately value his backup, whoever that is, crazy high because he just inherited this massive fucking workload that you're not going to get from a wide receiver 8 that you're hoping is going to get some run later in the year. So
everyone knows it's Reggie Bonifant. That's his backup.
Thank you, man. Really, 100%. I feel that way too. So he's a guy in my last round that I'm 100% going to scoop up. And in normal years, I'd be pissed because if CMC doesn't have to step away, well, then you have a roster clog. And in a normal year, you're banking on an injury that has like a 10% shot maybe at happening. But this year, I feel like you've got about a 50-50 shot of going down. And so it's just a much higher reward situation. So I'm handcuffing this year, man.
Yeah, and I'm along the same lines talking COVID. This is the perfect time of the year to get with your league mates, talk to your commissioner, get a vote out there about expanding your IR spots for COVID players. Because there is no reason you should have to have them on your bench, just sitting there, taking up space if they can't play and they're ruled out. And it is not an injury, but there needs to be a designation for that. And then also too, if your league uses the FAB system, so free agent budget, maybe talk to your commissioner about upping that for this season. If you do a $100 budget, maybe do 150, maybe 200, because there is a good possibility that you're going to be making more waiver claims than normal. And if these very valued handcuffs are out on your waiver wire, you will be spending more. So there's that opportunity that where you just don't go all in on one guy, and then 2 weeks later, another one of your players goes out, and you need to get another backup, but you already spent all your fab, so someone else snags them. So just a couple other considerations there too, as far as league settings go for this year.
Yeah, just manage your fab more diligently, I think, this year. Like, don't be that guy, because you're right, because you're going to have to use probably a lot more waiver pickups than you ever have before. So don't go, oh, shit, I got to pick up Jordan Wilkins this week because Marlon Mack is out, and so he might get a couple of runs while Jonathan Taylor does all of the actual work. And so I'm going to spend $30 on Jordan Wilkins, which would be stupid in a normal year, but extra stupid in this year.
That's right. Do you have anything else, Jake, you want to tell our listeners here?
Fuck kickers and defenses.
Yes. If you still have them in your league, don't draft them until the last 2 rounds. There's no reason to. You might think, oh, Jacksonville's defense, they were great last year. They're going to be great again this year. No, it's such a fickle position. You have no clue what's going to go on.
It almost never happens. They almost never duplicate.
Same thing with kickers.
Unless you're Gronkowski.
Well, I drafted him early one season, and he had a very off year that year, so it backfired on me. So it just don't do it. Draft him in your last 2 rounds, and also don't worry about bye weeks. So what if all your players have the same bye week? You take 1 loss on the season. It doesn't matter. That's my philosophy.
I have to disagree with you just a tad bit on that. I think it's reasonable during the draft to not concern yourself too much with the bye week. I think it should be a tiebreaker for you, though. If you have 2 guys in a similar tier, for example, that are on the clock and they're the last 2 in that tier, then you should absolutely look at that bye, though, to use
that
as a
could be a tiebreaker. And I would consider bye weeks if I'm drafting a second quarterback, just because you don't want your 2 quarterbacks on the same bye. You do want to be able to have a legitimate roster each week to submit. But when it comes to other positions, it's like, running back, wide receiver. I just don't pay attention. Or if my running back and quarterback have the same one, it's like, whatever. I'll take the loss for 1 week if it means my team is stacked every other week.
Yes. Or if you have free run of the waivers and you have a good bench size and you don't have to worry about it because you can swap out a couple of those dudes and make it work. All good. So yes, I agree, I think, with the principle of it, but I think there are some asterisks next to it that you can consider.
Yes. Well, how do you feel about this, Jake? You feel like we did good?
I feel like we did great. Now, the only thing that needs to sustain this episode is an actual season to follow so everybody can use this advice.
Very true. Very true. So thank you, folks, for tuning in this week. For YouTube, hit the subscribe button and the little bell. You'll get notified when we go live. As I said earlier, and we've seen scrolling across the bottom here for our YouTube watchers, we are at Drinking Fantasy on Twitter. So check us out there. We have lots of great content. You can find me at FF Dusty Dog on Twitter.
You can find me at Jake Trowbridge.
And until next week, folks, keep drinking and talking fantasy football.
Cheers, FFers.